Ladies and gentlemen, imagine a world where power alone does not define truth, where decisions are not measured by convenience, but by courage, where history is shaped by those who dare to stand for what is right, even when it is difficult. Today, we revisit a vision of a leader whose words challenged the world and whose foresight continues to resonate decades later. This is not just a story about politics or borders. It is a story about justice, morality, and the responsibility each of us carries to uphold human dignity. As we explore his insights, you will discover lessons that are timeless, lessons that speak to leaders, thinkers, and anyone who believes that meaningful change comes from principle, not compromise. Stay with me, because what we uncover today is more than history. It is a blueprint for courage, a call to conscience, and a reminder that standing for what is right has the power to change everything. Bhutto's insistence on justice over convenience was a defining element of his foreign policy and political vision, especially regarding Israel and the Palestinian issue. He approached the matter not as a transient political maneuver, but as a question of moral principle and historical responsibility. From the very beginning of his political career, he recognized that the displacement and dispossession of Palestinians represented a fundamental violation of human dignity and rights. He understood that political expediency might encourage some to ignore the suffering of millions, but he refused to compromise on what he perceived as the ethical imperative to stand with those whose rights had been denied. This stance reflected a broader worldview in which leaders are judged not only by their ability to navigate immediate political gains, but also by their commitment to fairness, equity, and adherence to international norms. Bhutto consistently argued that ignoring injustice in the name of short-term stability ultimately undermines long-term peace and security, because unresolved grievances fester and generate cycles of conflict. His approach contrasted sharply with realpolitik strategies that prioritize strategic alliances or economic advantages at the expense of moral clarity. He insisted that the international community, and particularly those nations that value human rights and legal frameworks, had a responsibility to oppose actions that violated the rights of Palestinians, including the forced occupation of territories, displacement of populations, and denial of sovereignty. Bhutto framed the issue in universal terms, appealing to conscience rather than sectarian loyalty. By doing so, he positioned Pakistan as a voice not only for Muslim solidarity, but also for global ethical standards, suggesting that true leadership requires courage to confront wrongdoing wherever it occurs, even if that stance invites criticism or challenges existing alliances. His speeches repeatedly highlighted the need for a principled stance that does not yield to pressure from more powerful states or succumb to the temptations of opportunistic diplomacy. In essence, Bhutto's advocacy reflected a vision of international relations rooted in justice, where policies are evaluated not merely on tactical outcomes, but on their alignment with human rights, fairness, and historical rectitude. He believed that only by upholding justice consistently could nations cultivate genuine credibility, moral authority, and lasting influence on the global stage. His commitment to principle over convenience remains a touchstone for those seeking to balance ethical responsibility with political strategy in contemporary international affairs. Bhutto's emphasis on international law and adherence to United Nations resolutions was central to his argument regarding Israel and the Palestinian issue. He firmly believed that global governance structures and legal frameworks exist to prevent arbitrary use of power and to safeguard the rights of smaller or less powerful nations. For him, international law was not an abstract concept, but a practical instrument for ensuring justice and holding violators accountable. He repeatedly cited UN resolutions concerning the partition of Palestine, the recognition of Israeli statehood, and the rights of displaced Palestinians to highlight the obligations of the international community. By invoking these frameworks, he underscored that Israel's actions in occupied territories, the shifting of borders, and the control over Jerusalem were not merely political maneuvers, but violations of established international norms. Bhutto viewed these violations as dangerous precedents, warning that when the law is ignored, it emboldens further transgressions and undermines the credibility of international institutions. He argued that adherence to these norms was essential not only for justice in Palestine, but for maintaining stability and predictability in global relations. His focus on law and resolutions was also a strategic appeal to nations in Europe and elsewhere that prided themselves on legal frameworks and human rights. By framing the Palestinian issue in these terms, he made it difficult to dismiss the matter as a purely regional or sectarian conflict. Furthermore, he emphasized that true leadership required a commitment to principles, even when power dynamics are unequal. According to Bhutto, when stronger states ignore international law to serve immediate interests, they risk long-term instability and moral erosion. He positioned Pakistan as a nation willing to uphold these standards, not as a form of defiance, but as a responsibility to the global order. His speeches frequently highlighted that solutions imposed without legal or ethical legitimacy are unsustainable, and that peace built on coercion rather than law is inherently fragile. By grounding his arguments in legal obligations, he transformed the debate from a binary of supporter versus opponent to a universal question of justice and accountability. This approach also allowed him to critique the broader patterns of power politics without appearing purely ideological, emphasizing that international law is a tool to protect all nations, not only those directly affected by the conflict. His insistence on law and resolutions reflected a vision in which moral clarity and strategic diplomacy converge, reinforcing the idea that justice and legality must guide the actions of nations in pursuit of lasting peace. Bhutto's focus on the significance of Jerusalem reflected his deep understanding of the symbolic, religious, and political weight the city carries, not just for the Muslim world, but for humanity at large. He recognized that Jerusalem is more than a geographical location. It embodies identity, faith, and historical memory for millions of people. In his speeches, he repeatedly emphasized that any attempt to alter the status of Jerusalem or undermine its cultural and religious heritage would not be a mere local or regional issue, but a moral and political concern for the entire international community. Bhutto saw the city as a litmus test for justice, where the principles of sovereignty, human rights, and international law intersect. He argued that Israel's control over Jerusalem, combined with policies that marginalized the Palestinian population and restricted access to holy sites, violated not only UN resolutions, but the broader ethical responsibilities of nations that claim to uphold human rights. For him, Jerusalem was a red line that should not be crossed because its occupation and the changes imposed upon it carried profound consequences for regional stability and global perception of fairness. Bhutto also framed Jerusalem as a rallying point for solidarity, urging nations and leaders to recognize that defending the rights of its inhabitants is a matter of principle rather than political convenience. He highlighted that ignoring or normalizing actions that undermine the city's heritage and the rights of its people sets dangerous precedents for international law and moral accountability. By focusing on Jerusalem, he brought attention to the lived realities of those directly affected, emphasizing that the plight of ordinary citizens, displaced families, and communities under occupation cannot be separated from abstract political debates. Bhutto's rhetoric underscored that the city's significance transcends religion and politics, calling upon Europe and the global community to consider the ethical implications of their stances and alliances. He also cautioned that any attempt to unilaterally redefine Jerusalem's status or to consolidate control through coercion or settlement expansion would not only perpetuate injustice, but would also exacerbate tensions, fuel resentment, and compromise the prospects for sustainable peace. His emphasis on Jerusalem demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both symbolic and practical aspects of conflict resolution, showing that protecting the rights of people and the integrity of sacred spaces is integral to achieving long-term stability. By highlighting Jerusalem, Bhutto articulated a vision in which justice, historical consciousness, and ethical responsibility converge, reinforcing the idea that respect for the city and its inhabitants is inseparable from the pursuit of fairness and peace in the broader region. Bhutto's advocacy for solidarity emphasized that support for the Palestinian cause was not merely a political stance, but a moral and ethical obligation that transcended borders, cultures, and religions. He believed that nations, particularly those that uphold principles of human rights, justice, and equality, could not remain indifferent to the plight of a people whose basic rights were systematically denied. In his speeches, he often framed solidarity not as charity or opportunistic diplomacy, but as a fulfillment of responsibility toward universal human values. Bhutto argued that turning a blind eye to injustice anywhere erodes the moral authority of those who claim to champion fairness and undermines the credibility of international institutions designed to uphold peace and order. He challenged leaders and citizens alike to recognize that ethical principles must guide foreign policy decisions, and that real leadership requires courage to support those who are marginalized or oppressed. By emphasizing solidarity, he connected the Palestinian struggle to a broader human context, highlighting that defending rights in one part of the world reflects a commitment to justice everywhere. Bhutto also underscored that solidarity is a strategic and principled form of engagement, not a passive sentiment. It involves advocating for political solutions, diplomatic pressure, and international cooperation to ensure that laws and agreements are respected. He insisted that genuine solidarity cannot coexist with silence in the face of illegal occupation or displacement, and that it demands active participation in shaping outcomes that align with fairness and human dignity. His vision extended beyond religious or regional affiliations. He urged European nations and other members of the global community to consider the universal ethical implications of their policies and actions. Bhutto portrayed solidarity as a mechanism to prevent the erosion of moral norms, warning that ignoring systemic injustice emboldens aggressors and perpetuates cycles of conflict and resentment. He also highlighted that acting in solidarity fosters a sense of shared responsibility and interconnectedness, reinforcing the idea that international affairs are not merely transactions of power, but arenas where values and principles must be upheld. By framing support for Palestine in these terms, Bhutto elevated the discussion from partisan politics to one of collective human conscience, encouraging a worldview where justice is measured not by convenience or alliances, but by adherence to ethical imperatives and the protection of vulnerable communities. And his message conveyed that lasting peace and stability are achievable only when solidarity is rooted in principle, actively practiced, and universally acknowledged as a cornerstone of responsible international engagement. So Bhutto's warnings about the consequences of ignoring injustice reflected his deep understanding of the long-term dynamics of conflict and the moral obligations of nations. He consistently argued that when violations of rights and sovereignty are overlooked, whether for political expediency, strategic alliances, or economic gain, the result is not stability but instability that festers over time. He emphasized that unresolved grievances create cycles of resentment, retaliation, and unrest that inevitably spread beyond their immediate context, affecting regional and even global security. His speeches repeatedly highlighted that short-term solutions imposed by power without addressing the root causes of injustice are inherently fragile and often counterproductive. Bhutto believed that failing to confront wrongdoing signals to aggressors that actions have no moral or legal consequences, thereby encouraging further violations. In the context of Israel and Palestine, he warned that ignoring the plight of displaced populations, the occupation of territories, and the suppression of political rights would not only deepen local suffering, but would also erode international trust, destabilize diplomatic relations, and perpetuate hostilities for generations. He urged the international community, especially nations with influence and moral responsibility, to act decisively in addressing these injustices rather than postponing action for the sake of convenience or fear of confrontation. Bhutto's perspective was grounded in both ethical and strategic considerations. Justice is not simply a moral imperative, but a practical foundation for sustainable peace. He maintained that lasting resolution requires acknowledging historical wrongs, protecting human rights, and ensuring accountability for those who perpetrate violations. His warnings extended to the consequences of silence, stressing that complicity through inaction contributes to the perpetuation of conflict and undermines the credibility of institutions meant to safeguard global order. By drawing attention to these long-term repercussions, Bhutto sought to convince policymakers, diplomats, and the public that principled intervention is necessary not only to uphold moral values, but also to prevent cycles of violence that threaten stability and prosperity. His foresight demonstrated an acute awareness of how neglecting justice in one region can ripple across borders, influencing international relations, public perception, and the ethical standing of nations. Through his speeches, he consistently highlighted that ignoring injustice today sows the seeds of conflict tomorrow, and that enduring peace can only be built upon the recognition and rectification of past and ongoing wrongs, ensuring that ethical responsibility and strategic prudence go hand in hand in global policymaking. Bhutto's vision of a peace built on justice reflected his belief that sustainable resolution to conflicts cannot be achieved through coercion, force, or superficial agreements, but only through addressing the core issues of rights, sovereignty, and historical grievances. He argued that attempts to impose solutions without recognizing the legitimate claims of affected populations are inherently unstable and likely to generate resentment, resistance, and ongoing hostility. In his speeches, he consistently emphasized that the Palestinian question required a resolution that acknowledged the rights of displaced people, the integrity of their lands, and the cultural and religious significance of key territories, particularly Jerusalem. Bhutto maintained that only by restoring justice and ensuring equality could a genuine and lasting peace be established, one that would be respected by all parties and recognized internationally. He warned that any settlement that ignored these principles would be temporary, fragile, and ultimately counterproductive, as it would fail to resolve the underlying causes of conflict and instead perpetuate cycles of tension and violence. His perspective combined ethical, political, and strategic dimensions, recognizing that moral legitimacy enhances stability and international credibility, whereas ignoring justice weakens authority and fosters mistrust. Bhutto also framed justice as a collective responsibility, not limited to the parties directly involved, but extending to the international community, which is both a moral and legal duty to support fair resolutions and uphold human rights. He insisted that solidarity and cooperation among nations are crucial for facilitating equitable solutions and for reinforcing the principle that violations of rights cannot go unchallenged. And in advocating for a peace built on justice, he highlighted the importance of dialogue, negotiation, and adherence to international norms, stressing that these elements are essential for creating agreements that are durable, respected, and morally defensible. Bhutto's speeches conveyed that justice is not only an ethical imperative, but also a strategic necessity. Only solutions grounded in fairness and recognition of rights can prevent future conflicts and provide a stable foundation for regional and global security. He underscored that leaders and nations must prioritize these principles over temporary political gains or narrow interest, understanding that the legitimacy of any peace process depends on the inclusion of fairness, equity, and respect for historical realities. Through his advocacy, Bhutto articulated a vision in which moral responsibility, practical diplomacy, and long-term stability converge, demonstrating that the path to enduring peace lies not in domination or compromise of justice, but in the careful and principled resolution of conflicts through recognition, restitution, and ethical governance. In conclusion, the life and vision of Zulfiqar Ali Bhutto remind us that true leadership is measured not by convenience or temporary gains, but by the courage to stand for justice, principle, and the rights of those who cannot speak for themselves. His unwavering stance on Israel and the Palestinian issue teaches us that ethical clarity, adherence to international law, and solidarity with the oppressed are not optional. They are essential foundations for lasting peace and global stability. Bhutto's foresight, moral conviction, and insistence on fairness continue to resonate today, urging leaders and citizens alike to act with conscience, to challenge injustice, and to build a world where dignity and rights are upheld for all. May we carry forward his vision, learn from his courage, and be inspired to make decisions guided by integrity, compassion, and the pursuit of lasting solutions that honor humanity. Good luck to each one of you as you engage with these ideas and strive to make a difference in your own spheres of influence. Thank you for your attention, your openness to learning, and your commitment to justice and understanding. Bhutto was right about Israel, the speech that changed everything.